Today we will explore one of the darkest and most fascinating aspects of medieval justice, the fate of those who were declared outlaws, men and women who, by decree of the authorities, lost all legal protection and became legitimate prey for any citizen willing to hunt them down. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine yourself walking through a dense forest in 13th century England. The sun barely penetrates the tree canopy, and the silence is broken only by the distant song of birds and the snapping of twigs under your feet. You are alone, or at least you believe so, until you realize that you are not just walking through any forest. You are crossing a territory where the common rules of society do not apply, where desperate men hide among the shadows, fleeing a fate that many considered worse than death itself. These men were not just ordinary criminals. They were the proscribed, the banished, those whom the law had abandoned, and their story is much more complex and terrifying than popular legends lead us to believe. When we think of medieval outlaws, our minds often evoke romanticized images of noble bandits, skilled archers dressed in green, who stole from the rich to give to the poor. These stories, passed down through generations, transformed dark figures into folk heroes, symbols of resistance against tyranny. But the reality behind these legends was very different. To be declared an outlaw in medieval Europe did not simply mean being wanted by justice. It meant being completely erased from legal existence, transformed into something less than human in the eyes of society. To truly comprehend the terror of this condition, we must first understand how the medieval legal system worked. In the societies of the High Middle Ages, the law was not just a set of abstract rules applied by distant institutions. It was the very fabric that held the community together, the invisible contract that guaranteed mutual protection among the members of a society. To be within the law meant belonging, having rights, being recognized as a human being worthy of protection. To be placed outside of it was the equivalent of a civil death, a complete social annihilation that transformed the person into prey. The process by which someone became an outlaw varied according to the time and place, but it followed recognizable patterns throughout medieval Europe. In England, for example, the path to prescription often began with a judicial summons. If an individual was accused of a serious crime and refused to appear before the local court, the authorities would issue successive summons. Each refusal aggravated the accused's situation. After 3 or more absences, depending on the jurisdiction, the court would formally declare that person an outlaw. From that moment on, their life changed forever in an irreversible way. In medieval England, the courts used a Latin expression that captured all the brutality of this sentence: caput lupinum. These words, which literally mean that the head of the condemned would be like that of a wolf, carried devastating implications. The English jurist Henry de Bracton, writing in the 13th century in his work on the laws and customs of England, explained that outlaws bore the wolf's head, which meant they could be killed without any subsequent judicial investigation. Just as a wolf was considered a dangerous predator that any villager had the duty to strike down upon encounter, the outlaw was reduced to the status of a wild animal, a threat to be eliminated without mercy or hesitation. This comparison with the wolf was neither accidental nor merely symbolic. In Germanic and Anglo-Saxon societies, the wolf occupied a particular place in the collective imagination. It was seen as the antithesis of human civilization, a creature that lived in the wild spaces beyond the borders of the ordered community. By declaring that a criminal bore the wolf's head, medieval authorities were making a profound statement about that person's nature. They had lost their humanity by violating social norms and now belonged to the world of beasts, not the world of men. Some historical evidence suggests that in even more ancient times, this association was ritualized in a literal way, with criminals being expelled from the community with a wolf's head tied to their neck, forced to wander the wilderness like the creatures with which they had been identified. The practical consequences of being declared an outlaw were immediate and devastating. The moment the sentence was pronounced, the condemned lost all their legal rights. Their properties, lands, and possessions were confiscated by the crown or the feudal lord. Any money they possessed became the property of the authorities. Their family ties, although not formally dissolved, became extremely dangerous for everyone involved. For medieval law did not only punish the outlaw himself, but also anyone who dared to help him in his flight or survival. It was strictly forbidden to provide outlaws with the most basic necessities of human existence. Giving them food was a crime punishable by severe penalties. Offering them shelter was an equally grave crime. Even providing them with water or allowing them to warm themselves by one's fire was considered illegal aid to a fugitive criminal. Anyone who transgressed this prohibition ran the risk of suffering severe punishments, including the possibility of being declared an outlaw themselves. Thus, prescription did not only isolate the condemned, but created a vacuum around them, a zone of exclusion that encompassed all those who might feel compassion for their situation. Even close family members, parents, children, siblings, spouses, faced the terrible choice between abandoning their loved one to their fate or risking sharing their destiny in the shadows of the forest. The most terrifying aspect of the outlaw condition was perhaps the total physical vulnerability it imposed. If someone encountered an outlaw and decided to kill him, they would face no legal consequences for that act. In fact, killing an outlaw was often seen as a meritorious act, a service rendered to the community and social order. In some jurisdictions, there were official rewards offered for their heads, encouraging ordinary citizens to become man-hunters. But outlaws were not hunted only by ordinary citizens in search of rewards or moved by a sense of civic duty. Feudal authorities maintained law enforcement systems that actively pursued those who had been placed outside legal protection. In England, the sheriff, whose title derived from the Anglo-Saxon expression shir reeve, meaning the administrator of the county, was primarily responsible for maintaining order and capturing fugitive criminals. The sheriff had the authority to summon the posse comitatus, a force of armed men from the county who could be gathered quickly to pursue criminals. When a notorious outlaw was identified in a certain region, the sheriff could mobilize dozens or even hundreds of men to scour forests, examine villages and watch roads in search of the fugitive. In addition to the sheriffs, there were bailiffs, officers who operated at more local levels, responsible for executing judicial orders and capturing suspects within their jurisdictions. Constables were also gradually incorporated into the law enforcement system, supervising night watches and coordinating search efforts in their parishes. All this apparatus was at the disposal to hunt down those who had been declared outlaws, and the brutality with which these officers often operated was notorious. Outlaws captured alive could be summarily executed by sheriffs or bailiffs without the need for a new trial, as their sentence of prescription already amounted to an open death sentence. Given such circumstances, it is not difficult to imagine why many outlaws fled to the forests and wilderness regions, places where the reach of authorities was more limited and where the chances of survival, though precarious, were greater than in populated areas. In England, forests like Sherwood, which extended for about 100,000 acres in the 13th century, covering approximately 1/5 of the entire county of Nottinghamshire, offered refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. The dense cover of oaks and birches, interspersed with clearings of heather and wild pastures, provided hiding places and resources for those who knew how to live off the land. The main road connecting London to York crossed through Sherwood, and travellers who ventured along it were often at the mercy of bandits who lived beyond the limits of the law. It is in this context that we must place the legends of bandits who robbed from the rich to give to the poor. Real outlaws had no choice but to live in ways that society considered criminal, as they were completely excluded from legitimate means of subsistence. Hunting in the royal forests, which were reserved for the king and the nobility, became a necessity for survival. Robbing travelers was often the only way to obtain basic provisions such as food, clothing, and tools. And although many outlaws were likely simply desperate men trying to survive another day, some may have distributed part of their illicit gains to sympathetic peasants who offered them information or discreet assistance. From these dark realities were born the seeds of the heroic legends we know today in ballads and folk tales. The history of proscription is not limited to medieval England. This legal concept had much older roots and manifested in different forms throughout Europe. The Romans, whose influence deeply shaped European legal systems, had their own concept of legal exclusion. The homo sacer, which can be translated as the cursed or sacred man, was a figure from archaic Roman law who occupied a paradoxical position in society. This person could be killed by anyone without the killer committing a crime, but at the same time, he could not be sacrificed in religious rituals. He was a being excluded from both the human community and the divine community, suspended in a terrifying legal limbo between social life and death. More common and documented was the Roman penalty known as aquae et ignis interdictio, the interdiction of water and fire. This sentence, which dates back at least to the Roman Republican period, prohibited any citizen from providing the condemned with the most basic elements necessary for human life. Water for drinking and fire for cooking and warmth were denied to the sentenced person, making their stay in Roman territory virtually impossible. In practice, the interdiction functioned as an order of forced exile. The condemned had to leave Roman lands or face certain death by deprivation, or by the hand of any citizen who complied with the prohibition of not providing him aid. Among the Germanic peoples who inhabited northern Europe, proscription took particularly severe forms. In primitive Germanic legal systems, the death penalty as we know it, a formal execution conducted by the state, was notably absent. In its place, the most severe of punishments was the declaration of proscription, known in different contexts as Friedlosigkeit, the loss of peace, or Akt, the banishment. To be declared Friedlos literally meant losing the peace of the community, being excluded from the social pact that guaranteed mutual protection among the members of society. Centuries later, the term Vogelfrei emerged in the Germanic context, which literally meant free as a bird. This expression, which initially could carry positive connotations of freedom and independence, assumed a much more sinister meaning in the legal vocabulary over time. To be vogelfrei meant having the same legal rights as a wild bird, that is, none. Just as anyone could hunt a bird without facing consequences, anyone could do the same to a person declared vogelfrei. Some historical accounts indicate that the bodies of executed outlaws were left in the open to be consumed by birds of prey, a literal and macabre expression of the term's meaning. In Viking Scandinavia, proscription was known as utlegd in Old Norse, and it played a central role in the legal system of the assemblies known as things. In medieval Iceland, there were two main forms of proscription. Lesser proscription condemned the culprit to 3 years of banishment, after which he could theoretically return to society. Full proscription, called skoganger, literally going to the forest, was a permanent sentence that transformed the condemned into a skogarmader, a forest man, perpetually excluded from the human community. Among all the famous outlaws of Scandinavian history, few had as lasting an impact as Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red. Born in Norway around 950, Erik inherited from his father both a violent temperament and a tendency to get into trouble with the law. When his father was exiled from Norway for homicide, the whole family moved to Iceland in search of a new beginning. But history would repeat itself. In Iceland, Erik married and established a farm, but his explosive temper soon put him in conflict with neighbors. Disputes over property and livestock escalated into violent confrontations, resulting in the death of several men at Erik's hands. Around 982, the Assembly of the Icelandic Thing pronounced his sentence, lesser proscription for 3 years. Refusing to passively accept his fate, Erik decided to use his forced exile to explore lands that had been vaguely sighted to the west. For 3 years, he explored the southwest coast of a large island, discovering protected fjords with surprisingly green valleys and pastures suitable for raising livestock. When his period of banishment ended, he returned to Iceland with enthusiastic stories about the land he had found. With characteristic cunning, Erik gave this land the name Greenland, Terra Verde, although much of it was covered in ice. According to the sagas, he chose this name because he believed people would be more willing to go there if it had an attractive name. His strategy worked. Eric managed to gather a fleet of 25 ships loaded with settlers, their belongings, and their livestock. Only 14 ships reached their destination, the others being lost in storms or forced to return, but the survivors established the first permanent Norse settlements in Greenland. The outlaw who had been expelled from 2 communities for his crimes now ruled an entire land. His son, Leif Erikson, would explore even further west and become the first European to set foot on the North American continent. The proscription of Eric the Red, which could have been his destruction, paradoxically became the catalyst for one of the greatest exploratory expeditions of the medieval era. While explorers like Eric transformed their exile into opportunity, most outlaws faced much darker fates. Without the resources or determination to undertake epic journeys across unknown seas, most of the banished wandered the fringes of society, always fleeing, always hungry, always afraid. Those who managed to survive longer usually did so by forming bands with other outlaws, groups of desperate men who joined forces for mutual protection and to carry out coordinated attacks against travelers or isolated villages. The daily life of a medieval outlaw was marked by constant deprivation. Without access to proper shelter, the banished slept in caves, under trees, or in makeshift shelters of branches and foliage. Food was always scarce, obtained through poaching, gathering wild fruits and roots, or theft. Winter was particularly brutal, with many outlaws succumbing to the cold, hunger, or disease. In addition to physical hardships, there was the psychological torment of isolation. Outlaws lived knowing that anyone they encountered could be their killer. They could trust no one, as the reward for turning in or killing an outlaw could be too tempting. As the Middle Ages progressed and European legal systems became more sophisticated, the practice of proscription gradually began to decline. The strengthening of royal power centralized the administration of justice. The development of prison systems offered alternatives to total exclusion from society. The influence of the Church, with its emphasis on the possibility of repentance and redemption, also contributed to moderating some of the more extreme practices of secular justice. However, proscription did not disappear completely. In England, it remained technically available as a legal option until surprisingly late. The notable case of William John Banks, a member of Parliament who was declared an outlaw in 1841 for being absent from his trial, demonstrates that the mechanism was still operational in the 19th century. It was only in 1879 that civil proscription was formally abolished in England. Criminal proscription, already obsolete in practice, was officially removed from English statutes in 1938. It is fascinating to contemplate that this medieval punishment technically survived into the era of the automobile, the radio, and the cinema. The stories of medieval outlaws continue to fascinate us precisely because they touch on something fundamental about the human condition: the fear of exclusion, of abandonment, of being cut off from the bonds that connect us to other human beings, is one of the deepest fears we can experience. Medieval outlaws lived this fear in its most extreme form, transformed by the force of law into wolves among men, hunted and feared, forced to exist in a terrifying limbo between life and death. Their stories, whether those of legendary bandits, explorers like Eric the Red, or the countless anonymous individuals who simply perished in the dark forests, all remind us of the invaluable worth of belonging. When we contemplate the history of proscription, we are confronted with the fragility of the social bonds we take for granted. Civilization, with its laws, its institutions, its protections, is a human construction that can be taken away as easily as it is granted. Medieval people understood this viscerally, for they lived in a world where the boundary between order and chaos was thin and constantly threatened. At the end of our journey through the history of medieval proscription, what remains is a renewed appreciation for the complexity of human justice and the precariousness of our belonging to the community. The outlaws of the medieval era were real people who faced terrible circumstances. Their stories remind us that the law can be both a protective shield and a punishing sword. And perhaps, by contemplating their fates, we can value a little more the invisible bonds that keep us connected to one another, the bonds that transform a collection of individuals into a community, And so we come to the end of this narrative about the outlaws of the medieval era, men and women who lived in the shadows of history, hunted like wolves, free like condemned birds. If this journey through the past has sparked your curiosity and enriched your understanding of the complex tapestry of human history, you know exactly what to do. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next explorations through the forgotten corridors of time. Leave your like as a sign that this story resonated with you, and share in the comments your thoughts, your questions, your own discoveries about this fascinating period. Each subscription, each like, each comment is like a torch lit in the darkness of the past, illuminating paths so that more people can walk these stories with us. Until the next journey, and may the law always be in your favor.